Welcome to episode 44 of Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Tonight I'm going to be giving an introduction to the notion of still life photography, although it comes out of the tradition of still life painting. So pretty much what happened was last week I had a go at creating a photo based on sort of still life paintings of the 17th century Dutch old masters. So I'm going to be talking about that tonight and feeding back on how that went. So just where are we? Not that one, and that one. So this was pretty much my go at it. Although this is the edited version, so I will take you through different variations of all the steps that I got to taking this photo and the steps that I took in editing it as well. Also, in the second part of this, we will be talking. I'll be giving feedback in the critique section. So we have Becca was looking for some feedback on a photo of this horse. Dion took this photo of baby jaguar and he was looking for some feedback on that. Lucas is making a start on still life, as was Marie as well. So I'll be giving feedback on both of those. Rosie has been doing an editing course where she's sort of been cutting out horse and rider, but doesn't feel that there's something not quite right about it and is looking into wanting a sort of bit more help and advice with that. Robert took this photo of cows, edited in, but it never quite gets, whilst it has some good response, it's never quite got the response he felt it should, and was sort of looking for some answers to that. Sandra having a go at still life, but kind of feeling a bit stuck and was wondering, how to move forward. And VG's been having a go at doing self-portraiture, playing around with lighting, and is looking for some feedback on that. So that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, I'm here live on Facebook, so leave your comments. Let me know you're here. Let me just pull that up. If this is your first time here, let me know where you're from, but do please say hi. It's always good to know that the people are watching and where people are coming from, and I always find it really exciting. So already we've got a couple of comments here. Good evening from Maggie, my wife. It's always a good start. Marie from South Africa says good evening all. Becca from Norfolk down in England says evening all. Nuria says good evening to you all. Lucas is saying good evening. Rosie is here. Good evening, everyone, from another wet and windy evening in Whithorn. Brian from Dumfries says hi to all watching in. Diana is good evening. Is good evening from Wales. Mandy is good evening from Dumfries. Stacey's heavy snowstorm there in Pennsylvania. Sandra is saying hi, everyone, from Birmingham. So this is great. So we've already got. And John Harvey has just come in with a hello from Columbus, Ohio. So hi John, glad you could make it. Glad you could all make it along. So we've got quite a good spread. Maya's just come in from Israel, and Sue, first time. Don't recognise your name, so we're glad you could make it. We're also from Columbus, Ohio. So cool. This is great. We're really getting some people sort of spread across the world here, which is always quite exciting. So welcome to you all. Now, I will periodically check in on the Facebook comments. I don't keep them live all the time because otherwise I keep kind of getting distracted. So if you find these podcasts particularly useful and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to go. It's not compulsory, but it is always appreciated. Right, okay. I think, also to let you know that these are recorded and put onto YouTube, which you can see youtube.com/Kim Ayres. Because I'm recording them straight off the computer, the quality tends to be slightly better, but then you don't get to ask questions as we go and comment and have the full kind of live experience. So If there's anything you miss or you would want to re-watch, then these are usually up by Wednesday afternoon. So 7:30 here in the UK, mid-afternoon over for our American friends, much later into the evening for Maya, and so yeah, it's kind of a bit of a spread here. Right, okay, I think that's what I wanted to do to start with. So let's move on, and what I want to do then is introduce this idea of still life photography. Basically, this kicked off a few weeks ago. Sandra from Birmingham said she was, could I talk a little bit about still life, especially given the fact that with everybody pretty much being in lockdown, certainly here in the UK, getting out and about and going off and doing wildlife and landscape photography and even street photography or many other kinds wasn't really much of an option. So stuff that you could do at home. And whilst it sounded like, quite a good idea, it sort of sounds fairly simple, the moment you start thinking about it or really looking into it, still life is much more potentially complex to try and explain, because it's a huge, huge subject. I mean, it is an entire genre in its own right, much like portrait photography, which I've been doing for well over a decade and still learning all the time, or landscape photography, or street photography. It's a genre in its own right. So to master it, or to master all aspects of it, could take you years or decades. Having said that, it's also a really good introductory or practice kind of thing to do, because exactly as Sandra said, you don't need to go out anywhere. It's something you can do at home in the house. Now, strictly speaking, still life is essentially an arrangement of inanimate objects, but obviously that can be a very wide ranging thing. So what I decided to do was I thought I would start off with the kind of traditionally what we think of as still life, which was looking at the Dutch Old Masters. Having said that, in fact, actually, it goes way back further than European 17th century painters. I mean, there's this fresco from Pompeii in the 1st century AD is essentially still life. So the Romans were at this 2,000 years ago. We've got the classic bowl of fruit, what looks like a split open pomegranate down on the left there, a tilted over jug, apples, grapes, So you've actually got pretty much everything you tend to think of immediately as a still life sitting in painted on a wall in Pompeii. So it's been around for a long time. But there was a point whereby within art, it really started to take hold around the sort of 15th, 16th centuries, and sort of happening in the Italian, with the Italian artists and the time of the Renaissance, and then took hold in the kind of Northern European Dutch Renaissance as well. Part of that, it has to be said, the popularity came about because of now I can't remember whether it's the Dutch Reformed Protestant Church or the Reformed Dutch Protestant Church or the Protestant Reformed Dutch Church. Unfortunately, I'm pretty terrible with details. However, one of those combinations of words. Essentially, with the replacement or overthrow of Catholicism back in the 17th century in a lot of the Northern European countries, Holland in particular, part of the beliefs or the religious systems at the time were about getting rid of iconography, and so the kind of religious paintings of Christ on the cross and all these kind of things and the Virgin Mary were suddenly frowned upon, or I'm not sure whether they were outlawed or not, but certainly at a time of religious division and where people could be burned at the stake for saying the wrong thing, is obviously something you had to kind of be a bit more careful about. As such, other things started taking on more prominence, and things like flowers and still life and food and what have you really started, growing in popularity. Now, there were symbolisms and what have you that were kind of sneaked in quite often. Every fruit, every flower has some kind of symbolic meaning. I mean, flowers, lilies represent purity and innocence and virginal, whereas something like deadly nightshade obviously has more corrupting kind of ideas. And so, likewise, apples, if you think of your Bible, Garden of Eden, the original sin can come from apples. So you can get things like that. And then also how ripe the fruit or the flowers were. Were they decaying or were they brilliantly ripe can also make a difference as well, as to whether you're making hidden or subtle messages about corruption, whether it's corruption of the soul or corruption of religion or corruption of the state. A lot of these old paintings, there's all sorts of hidden symbolism within them, which is great fun if you're into that kind of thing to go off and research. But a lot of it was also about showing off wealth or attitudes to life. So if we take something like this flowers, so this bouquet of flowers by Jan Bruegel the Younger, somewhere around 1606, 1607. So, I mean, it's an incredible display of flowers, huge array of colours and textures and different kinds of plants. And part of this wasn't just about creating a pretty picture. Some of these flowers were very exotic and in a different way to the way we kind of live now, whereby you can order a bunch of flowers online. In places where you're not in lockdown, you can go to a florist or and just pick up flowers from all sorts of different parts of the world. Flowers, that exotic flowers that are not native to the country you happen to be in. Back then, these things were expensive, really expensive, and so for the sort of mercantile class, the merchants and the moneyed class, to be able to sort of show off that they could get hold of these kinds of blooms was then as much about a status symbol as anything else. So a lot of still life started off with rich displays of flowers, but then we can also look at things like the kind of thing we often think of as a still life. This kind of where you've here we've got, it's a collection of different things in this. We've got things like, looks like probably open walnut shells, or got the peeled lemon. There's tobacco there for pipes, drinks, goblets, olives. So it's a sort of a mix of food, drink, smoke, indulgence, and some of these got very indulgent. I mean, this one here, we've got rich fruits, all the different kinds of grapes, but we've got oysters as well. And some of them went on to have sort of great big banquets of, lobsters and crabs and breads and cheeses and tables absolutely piled high. But then within that, there was another sort of set where what was known as vanitas, where if you notice, you've got things in here like a skull sitting over in the background here, and the cup is tilted over. And there was a whole thing here about putting in the vanitas came out of the sort of Latin memento mori, which previous to this you got in paintings, which essentially was about reminding you of your mortality, of the briefness of life, and as such, you ought to make sure that your life is, you lead a good life. You will be judged by God in heaven or whatever at the point you die. So these kind of reminders of mortality also quite often played a part in these paintings. But more than, well, not more than that, as well as that, these things were a real show-off for skill enhancer practice for the artists, because not only are you trying to depict realistic depictions of the fruit, the violin, the skull, in this case is even the reflection of the artist himself inside a silver ball. It is about things like the reflections, the use of light, the way things interact with each other in terms of shadows and colour bounces and the way you would compose. So in a way of both learning your trade and then showing off just how skilled you were, still life was sort of right at the heart of that as well. You really got to show how capable you were. Did the fruit on the table look like you could just sort of almost pick it out of the painting and eat it? So there's that skill side of it. There's the practice of it, just like we're talking about photography practice. You can do it at home. You're not having to worry about paying expensive models to hold a pose for several hours while you're painting some dramatic scene. But you've got that skill set going. It's a place to practice. And it can also be, you can put in, like I said, because of symbolism or things like that, particular items, cultural significance, political significance, religious significance. So there's all these kind of things that you can play around with, which go way beyond just having an apple and a pomegranate sitting on a silver tray. So how deep you want to take this is really entirely up to you. There's layer upon layer upon layer of things that you can do with still life. So that's why it sort of starts to become a much more complex subject. So having given that sort of bit of introduction to the background of it and what have you, I'll just take a quick check-in on Facebook, see whether we have any comments. If you've got any thoughts, put them in the comments, let me know. Like I say, I will periodically check in, see what you're chatting about. I'll try and answer any questions as we go. Sort of close down a few of these windows. And then I'll head back in a minute and show you the version that I was doing with the photography. So, all right, we got Anne from Dallas. Hi, Anne, glad you could make it. And Stacey says, I saw that in a book. That'll be one of the pictures we just looked. My parents brought home from Italy, which they went years ago. Okay, cool. Right, so let's flip back over to this photo. So this was my attempt at doing a still life. Now, in essence, now I decided not to go too much for the kind of deep symbolism and all this kind of stuff, because my primary purpose was to sort of replicate a mood or a feel with colour and shape and texture. So with the help of Maggie, my wife, we set about creating this. Now, to give you an idea, for those who were tuned in last week, I showed, this is the behind the scenes, took a quick photo on my phone to give you a sense of what was going on here. And what we've got is we've got my camera sitting on a tripod up on the left here. We've got a setup where I've got an upturned box, I've got a board, I've got another board behind it, and I've got a blue piece of heavy cotton hanging down behind, and then a tablecloth half draped. I mean, that was one of those things that I noticed that happened quite a lot in these kind of pictures, was that you would see the tablecloth that's sort of half on it. Was there one on here as well? Yeah. So you didn't always get the tablecloth going all the way across, you had it partially across. And so I wanted to sort of make sure again that it wasn't covering the whole thing. So trying to sort of get as many of the tropes as such, the kind of little ideas and signature pieces that you get within still life photography or still life painting. You can, so we got a bowl, pewter jug, little ceramic jug. Did have a glass of wine in an earlier version of the shot I was using it in, and then it just kind of didn't quite feel right, and for later shots I took it out. So that gives you the setup. That's kind of what I was playing with. So what I'll do now, I think, and I should have opened up Photoshop slightly earlier. I'll take you through a set of photos. Essentially how they sort of moved and adjusted as it went. So hopefully you can all see that now. So this was like, one of the early shots. We've placed, so you can see here we've got a pomegranate on wooden plate, orange peel hanging down, lemon peeled over here, green apple, pears, black grapes, green grapes, an orange behind here. So this was kind of where we go, click, how's that looking? Now, actually, I will just point out, because there is another important point here, which is what I decided to do with this was not to use artificial lighting, but to use natural window light. So all I'm using is a window that's coming in from the left of the picture. And that was really quite important for two reasons. One, I wanted to show that you don't need fancy lighting systems. You can do it just straightforwardly with window light. The second thing was actually, if you're trying to emulate paintings, especially kind of old master paintings, window light is the most natural light source, is the best light source to use, because essentially they didn't have electricity back then. So everything tends to either lit by the window light or candlelight. And most of these on a table still lifes tend to be lit by the window. So if you've got a window off to one side, and ideally don't have direct sunlight coming through it, either do it on a dull day, or use a window where the sun isn't coming directly in, or wait until the sun has moved round so it's not coming directly in, because a direct sunlight will create very hard shadows. And if you're trying to sort of emulate anything like a painting, you'll see they always have much softer shadows. So you need that sort of soft shadow that comes from a window without direct sunlight coming in it. So you've got your light source. So you can see, if we go back to here, that I've got the light coming in from the left. Whilst there is a candle, other than creating a couple of little kind of slight reflections in the grapes, it's not really having much effect in terms of lighting the scene. So we took a look, so this was our starting point. And then, having decided that the plate looked quite empty over here, sort of shifted stuff around, moved a little bit of green over here to balance the green over there, shifted a red apple over that way. Decided the problem was here was the pomegranate. We're getting the back of it being lit by the window, but the front of it, of course, is then kind of lost in the shadow. So we then swap that round. Now, and then I sort of curl that orange peel to sort of, so it drops down but then comes back up again. Then I did this little bit of where I was moving the jug about a little bit in the background to see where it should best be placed in relation to this candle. Little bit of move back. It was really a case of, I decided that I would have the candle running through, so there was a gap either side of the jug handle, so it's sort of moving through that bit. Slight shift over, Now at this point I've got the pear. If you look at the pear, is it sort of shooting up off into the left, and I kind of felt that part of the problem with that was it was creating a leading line which is sort of shooting you out of the picture. This is maybe one of those things I think I've talked about before, but I will talk about again. But that notion of leading lines within composition, whether it's painting or photography, when you have particular lines can draw your eye, you kind of follow the loop of the orange peel. So you come down here, but it doesn't shoot off down the bottom. It curls back up and brings your eye back up the way, so you then get drawn back to the pomegranate. This pear over on the left here is lying in such a way that the stalk is pointing back in. The curve of the tablecloth is bringing you back in. So there's certain sort of barriers you kind of you create so that subconsciously the person watching it doesn't shoot out the picture. They just kind of keep being brought back into it. So I felt that particular stalk was going in the wrong direction. So I then turned it around, slight light shift, and yeah, here we've got, moved the jug a little bit, wanted to turn it around, get a little bit more of the handle, decided to, the pear then just looked a bit too low. I wanted to have a little bit more upright, but maybe not that upright, and then tilt it over. And then this, in essence, is the starting point that I got to with with the picture. So once I got to this is then what I was going to start editing. So just close that one for a moment. I've got a couple more. Hello, Samantha has come in. Hi, Samantha. First time here, complete amateur. Welcome. VG from India says good evening. And Robert's come in with a howdy from Texas. So yeah, this is great. We've got a few more people coming along. Okay. So you've seen then that's how I got to the picture that I was then going to edit. So what I'll do now is I'll show you the editing sequence that I went through. I'm not going to sort of sit and literally edit it for you, but what I will do is show you how I started and essentially the major steps. So this, as you can see, it was the sort of finished level. And what's happened here? Okay. So I take that out. So the first thing I did was just start lightening it up a bit, bringing a little bit more detail out of the shadows. Then what I did was I started going around and getting rid of, so if you look at, I've got folds in the cloth up here, I've got a hole in the tablecloth down here. So the next thing I did was I went round, I removed the hole, got rid of these folds, and then this is one of the key things, is I changed the background from blue to green. And the reason for this was, in essence, blue was, you know, when you look at those still life paintings, blue just isn't used because blue was an extraordinarily expensive colour to create. What they had to grind up to make the paints just made it prohibitively expensive. So what you tend to find is in a lot of the old paintings, blue is kept back exclusively. So when you see the paintings of the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, she's always dressed in blue. And that's a sign, it's not just that they randomly chose a colour, it's quite deliberate because blue was such an expensive, it's like putting gold leaf on, you know, it's not something that's an everyday colour. So I went through with this. I mean, one of the interesting things you can do, because what I did was I selected the, where are we? If I go to the blues here, because nothing else was blue, I was able to fairly easily select the blue, and then let's see, saturation was sitting something like that, and I think that was like the original blue. And then you can, using the hue saturation tool, you can move it through purples, reds. If I wanted, I could boost that up a bit more, make it a brighter red, or take the saturation down, make it a sort of slightly muddier kind of colour. But at this, whilst I'd originally thought that I might sort of do a kind of earthy red kind of thing, in the end, when I looked at it, it didn't really seem to work right. I didn't feel that the colours worked so well. So I ended up going down the other way, down into the greens, and then pulled the saturation down more like that. So that just sort of worked, felt like it worked better. But the thing to do if you're playing with this is play, see what works for you. So then I went round with the dodge and burn, and essentially so you start highlighting some of the, bringing up some of the highlights, deepening some of the shadows, and it just sort of, it's almost like polishing the fruit and the crockery and what have you. Lightening it up again, and then I really sort of go to town bringing out texture and using the texture and clarity sliders. Little bit more brightness. Yes, then I became very aware down in this bottom corner of the fact that the board I put it on was sort of bending down a little bit, and I wasn't quite so keen on that, so I played around in Photoshop, straightened it up, and then tidied that bit up. Then we just a final kind of lightening up, and there we end up with the photo, with the picture. However, having said that, that wasn't the final thing. This was the picture I then put up on the event page to say, hey, I'm doing this still life introduction. And then I went back and looked at some more of these paintings and realised that the ones which did tend to have a candle in always had a snuffed out candle. I'd noticed things with candles, but it hadn't clicked to me that they were always snuffed out. And that snuffed out bit, so there's like a little bit of smoke trail, was tying back in with that vanitas that I was talking about, that notion of the reminder of the mortality, that life can end at any moment. And so my final version of this is now in fact this, where I photoshopped out the flame and added a little smoke trail to the top of it. So that then was my attempt at doing it. And I think I was quite pleased with the way that it turned out. I think it sort of has all the bits that I wanted to have in it. We've got the fruits, we've got the peel, we've got things like the way the light plays on the fruit, the way the light plays on things like the surfaces. You know, we've got with the pewter coffee pot here and the brass candlestick and the jug. We've got the wonderful textures of the inside of the pomegranate, and you know the lemon and the orange and what have you. Also, compositionally wise, there's a few things going on. We've got this sort of general arch here, except that it's not a complete. You've got a kind of, it sort of pulls down the way. Let's just pull into Photoshop again here. It's okay to play with the one with the line in it, but if the light rather. So if I just, let's just take a pencil for a moment. So in some ways it sort of shapes like that, except for the fact that it sort of comes down, and then you've got that kind of, got this movement down here. You've got the knife pulls you back up. You can kind of move down, you can do that, or you can, if you really follow the grapes down, the grapes kind of drop you down here and then catch the orange peel. The knife is pointing you, the jug is pointing you, this jug's pointing you. So this is curving you back, the pear is curving you back round. So there are these things that it's quite important. If you think about the fact, if those jugs were turned the other way, they would be pointing you out of the picture. So you're looking for ways to kind of draw the eye back in and around. So it kind of does all the bits that I wanted it to, and hopefully then has given you some ideas of what you can do. There's so many different ways you can go about it, but this I just thought would be a bit of a starter for you. So I hope you found that interesting. Let's see if we've got any more comments. Yeah, Marie says the background changed from blue and green. Right, oh, so that's an earlier, and then yes, thanks, questions answered. VG says it does look like a painting. And Becca says definitely better with the candle snuffed out. Yeah, and Samantha saying giving me lots to think about. Well, that's great. That's exactly the point. That's what I was hoping for. Thank you. Part of what makes it look like a painting is the composition. A large part of it is the lighting. It's going back to what I was saying about the notion of by using window light and not using a reflector. If I was doing a sort of product photo, I'd be much more likely to have a reflector on the other side to bounce some of that light back. And it was quite interesting because there was one point where I thought I would try that out and I put a reflector in and it sort of stopped looking like a painting so much. A reflector, that sort of use of more than one light source, is very much a photographic technique, and it isn't really something that was very often used by the painters, certainly not in the 17th century. So that's, it's something to keep in mind that depending on what you're trying to emulate, the lighting is very often key to whether it sort of appears successful or not. Is it hard shadows? Is it soft shadows? Is it a single light source? Is it multiple light sources? Are there reflections of light? Are there distortions of light? Are there shadows? Are there bounced colour reflections? So these kind of things really can kind of make a difference. Right. Okay. So what I will also do, though, is to... sorry, I've got a couple more comments here. Sandra says the texture in the background was turned green is lovely and the overall image is lovely. Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it definitely worked better in green than it did in blue. It just felt much more complementary, felt much more natural. That kind of blue isn't a natural blue anyway. So given the fact that the rest of the stuff was kind of organic, then it sort of felt more natural, I think, to have the green. Lucas says, my compositions are barbaric compared to this one. I think you are doing yourself down a bit there, Lucas. Sandra says, was it a bright or dull light coming through the window? It's very dull when I attempt my still life. Well, it was a bright day, but I had to make sure that the sun had moved around far enough so that it wasn't coming straight onto the thing. But it's really, there is, you can get into inverse proportional ratios if you want, but the reality is the closer to the light source you are, the better. The further you move away from your light source, it's not just it gets duller at the same rate. There's an exponential dullness. So you lose the light even more than you would expect. So if you move at half the distance, you lose more than half the amount of light that's falling on it. So in terms of when you're playing around with the camera and working out your f-stops or your ISO or your shutter speed and what have you, you'll find there's noticeable difference. So in essence, you want to, if you're going to create a little set like I had with a sort of box and board and piece of cloth, get it absolutely as close to the window as you can, and then shoot midday. Even on a dull day, if you can shoot around noon or something like that, you'll be getting maximum amount of light. So that's really the thing to remember, that is just get as close to your light source as you can without the light source actually getting into the photo. Okay. Oh, Maya says, Miss says very artistic photo. It's really breathing. Thank you. Okay, and Sandra says that's useful. Cool. Now, the next thing I wanted to show you was the notion that you don't actually just have to stick to fruit and bread and cheeses and flowers. I mean, one of the reasons I did fruit was availability. If I'd had flowers, I would have put flowers in, but we don't actually have any flowers. The garden is dead at the moment because it's the 2nd of February in the Northern Hemisphere in Scotland. So there's not a lot of plants growing in the garden at the moment. And because of lockdown, we're getting our orders, ordering online for things. So anyway, we had fruit in the house, we didn't have flowers, so that's why I chose that. But the thing is that you can go for anything. You don't have to be restricted to making it look like an old master's painting. So to show you briefly what I did, and I'll probably use this photo for next week. But one of the things I did was I decided to take the same lighting conditions and do a coffee pot. Now I've got a little single coffee pot, espresso pot, and a little espresso cup, and I got some coffee beans and I filled them. So I'm now going to show you this. So here you can see it's exactly that same, it's the table with the boards and the blue cloth on it. This time I'm keeping it blue because I'm not trying to be an old master but I am still just using daylight. I'm still using just purely the window light. And also, important point. I do want to, where are we? Where's the picture gone? There is another really important point about this, which is your depth of field, your aperture setting. If you're using your computer now, you're using your camera, and you're trying to emulate an old master style painting, the key thing is that they weren't working with lenses. They weren't working with aperture settings, right? So they don't go for narrow depth of focus and beautiful bokeh. Everything is in focus. If you look at these old paintings, if you look at something like this, other than things disappearing into the shadow at the back, it's as sharp in the foreground as it is in the background, because they're using their eyes, and their eyes are automatically adjusting focus as to where they look. So in order to get this, I had, what was my setting there? I had this set at f18. I could have added f16, f11 maybe would have got away with it, but I just wanted to be absolutely sure that when I did this, that the orange peel in the foreground was as sharp as the handle on the pot in the background. So yeah, aperture settings, really important part. If you're trying to make it look like a painting, you want a narrow aperture to give you a deep depth of focus, so that everything from front to back is in focus. Otherwise, it starts to look more like a photo than a painting. So yeah. So to come back to this one, I've now moved away from trying to do those old master tropes. So with this one, I've got an aperture setting of 5.6. I'm doing it at 1/6 of a second at ISO 100. So you can see here where if you just sort of follow the coffee beans, you can see it's slightly, it's a bit out of focus right at the front edge. The coffee beans come into focus and then it starts going out of focus again. And you can see, by the time you get that far back with that coffee bean's quite out of focus, and the background is now out of focus as well. But there's a sharp line that sort of is running from essentially where the coffee beans are. That includes the cup and the espresso pot. So we played around with a lot of little ideas with this, and it was just, I've seen pictures where you've had a cup, like a coffee cup, covered in coffee beans, and I thought, well, I fancy having a go at doing my own version of this. And I've got this wonderful little single espresso pot. So I thought, well, okay, let's do that. The little cup, by the way, is from a wonderful local potter called Clare Dawdry. And so her website is We Make Pots. I think it's .com. If it's not, it's .co.uk, but wemakepots.co.uk. or wemakepots.com. I'll double check that, and in the YouTube video I'll stick the address on. So you can buy her cups online. So wonderful local potter. Do check her out. And so the point being here though is that I'm using the same kind of natural daylight setup. But then you can also play, what also counts as still life is, so I then thought, well, okay, let's try another photo where what I will do is I will use a coffee pot and beans, but I'm going to shove on a backlight and I'm going to shove on a reflector, and I'm going to really kind of play around with, essentially it becomes like a 3-light setup. There's window light, which is acting as one, there's a backlight where I've got a flash going through diffusing material, and then I've got a reflector as well. And we end up with something like this. And this is very much modern style. You don't look at that and think old masters at all. That's very much a contemporary style of photo. We've got this fancy top here, which which is reflecting the pot. We've got bright light coming from behind. I've got a reflector which is bouncing the light back from that so that this isn't lost in silhouette. We've got the same basic idea as the previous photo, but it's a totally and utterly different photo, totally and utterly different mood, even using the same props. So I just wanted to show you that, just to kind of give you an idea of the fact that you can kind of do anything, really. You don't have to be restricted to trying to emulate something else, but go in and play. Okay, so a couple more comments here. Okay, Marie says, is only one article considered as a still life, or more, preferably more articles in the scene? I mean, you can, if you photograph one thing, then it's a photo of that thing. I don't think it's so much a still life. I mean, I'm not going to turn around and say that, here's where you draw the line and this is dictionary definition. I don't suppose it really matters. It's what you're comfortable with. I think really though, the thing about a still life is what you're doing is you're creating an arrangement of inanimate objects, whether that's flowers, pots, vases, cutlery, kitchen implements, dice, Lego figures, whatever you want to do. It's about creating some kind of composition and arrangement. Now you can see here, of course, that there's a massive overlap, say, with product photography. An awful lot of product photography is essentially a still life kind of thing. You're using light setups, you're taking an inanimate object and you're creating a composition out of it. So there's a lot of overlap with that, but quite often product photography in that kind of purer form is, say, if you've got a bottle of bleach or you've got a bottle of ketchup, sorry, that's my thing suddenly said reconnecting, so I don't know whether I lost you there for a moment. But what I was saying is, if you've got a single item that you're selling, then that really is about the product. That's what you're selling. The still life is more about creating an arrangement, a story, a mood, a feeling, or something around the combination. And as soon as you've got one object, as soon as you put another object in, you have to remember that there is then a relationship between the two, the distance between them, the colour schemes, whether there's shadows, whether there's reflections. If you've got a third object, there's now a relationship between the three of them. And this is where I think still life becomes really fascinating, and it becomes a place where you can dive in with your creativity and imagination. Is to start with one object and then think what will go with this object. Okay, Becca says you're frozen. I'm desperately hoping that that's now, because these tend to go about 15 seconds. You're about 15 seconds behind me, so I'm hoping that I've unfrozen by the time You finished reading that. Um, okay, what else have I got here? Stacey says she's got a special box for product shoots. Rosie asks what lens I'm using. Basically, I'm using my 70 to 2, my 24 to 70 lens. It's your mid-range lens. Wide angle lens is going to start distorting things at a distance. You could use a zoom lens, you just have to stand further back. And the problem is with the zoom lens is then that it compresses your depth of field. So, so that's my wife just telling me that I am back again. So that's useful. But yes, so if you've got an f5.6 on a 50mm lens, that might give you about that much depth, but on a 200mm lens, you've only got about that much depth. That's in focus. So the more you're zoomed in, even on the same aperture setting, the narrower your depth of field becomes. So I would go for a mid-range lens for something like that if you're wanting to make sure you've got depth. Okay, what else? Becca says, a bit earlier, she said, could we do a modern take on still life? And I think I answered that one with the coffee shots. Rosie says she keeps losing signal, so we'll watch the recording if it disappears. Hopefully you come back. And Sandra says she got a beautiful old teapot from a charity shop. Yeah, I mean, if you can get to the charity shops, then you can find all sorts of really useful gadgets and gizmos. But it's also just what's lying around your house. I mean, it's pretty amazing what we tend to have lying around. I mean, I've seen people doing things like, I was chatting to my wife earlier, I saw one where somebody got a cheese grater and they've got like a large big kind of big tomato, and then coming out the bottom of the cheese grater are a bunch of little baby plum tomatoes. So you can add humour, you can have fun with these things as well. Okay, so that then is really the idea with, hopefully that's given you some ideas. Now I'll talk a little bit more about this again at the end, but for next week, for the 9th of February, I'm setting a still life challenge. So this is your chance to create your own still life and stick the photos in. Now, for those of you who are new here, basically the general way these podcasts go is the first part I talk about a photo shoot I've done. Second part is the critique section, which is what we're going to be coming on to in a moment, where you can stick your photos in for feedback. But once a month I set a challenge, and that's a case of where you go off and you either raid your old folders and edit up your photo, or you go out and you take a photo on the idea and put in your best photo. And it really then becomes a case of, it's a chance for everybody else to see what everybody else has decided to do. It's a way of sharing, it's a way of inspiring. Because the great thing is, what I love about, you get any group of people, and that it's so noticeable here and the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres podcast, is the people who come back, the community that we're building up here are really varied in cultural background, parts of the world, ideas, concepts, upbringings, educational levels, doesn't matter. We've got a full kind of across the board. And what that means is everybody else is seeing things in a slightly different way than you do. And for creatives, that's just the most wonderful thing, because we are limited to seeing the world through our own eyes. But the moment we start seeing what other people are doing, we're now seeing the world becomes larger. What we can experience becomes larger. So the whole idea of the challenge is for people to put in their interpretation of whatever the challenge is. And then I'll go through them and I'll share them and I'll show them and we'll comment on them. So next week's challenge then is a still life challenge. Now the still life does not have to be like a Dutch old master. That was purely an intro. As you saw, I then moved on. You did different things with coffee pots. You can do anything you want. I'll reiterate this again at the end of the podcast, but I'll also talk bit more specifically about things to keep in mind. So that will be coming up. So what else have we got here? Oh, Anne says, I've always been a bit intimidated by still life, but this was helpful and I have some ideas to try. Well, that's great. Well, then that's lovely to hear, Anne. That really is. That makes me feel like what I'm doing something right. Oh, little break here. Just something for anybody who happens to be interested. Just before Christmas, I did an interview for DG Unlimited, DG standing for Dumfries and Galloway, which is this county in southwest Scotland where I live. And DG Unlimited is an organisation there to help assist artists and promote artists and makers and creatives in the region. And a strand that's come out of that is a set of audio podcasts run by Tabby, who is doing Voices Unlimited, DG Voices Unlimited. And anyway, basically just before Christmas, I was interviewed. And that's now out and about. If you go to the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, if you go to the Kim Ayres Photography Facebook page, scroll down a bit, you'll find the link. I was already talking about it. I think I put it in the group. If I didn't, I'll put it in the group again. In the YouTube recording, I'll put the link to it as well. And in fact, actually, I'll tell you what, I'll just drop it into the comments now. You can come back and find it again later. Link to a SoundCloud. Did that go in? I don't know. Yes, there you go. So that's now in the comments as well. But if you're watching the YouTube, I'll put a link to it in the comments there as well. So if you've got a spare 20 minutes and you fancy listening to me rabbiting on about photography, passion, obsession, these podcasts, then you can go and have a listen to that. And there's interviews with other creatives as well. So that's something to check out. Right, what we're going to do now then is move on to the critique section. So for those of you who haven't been here before, the idea with the critique section is this is the part of the podcast where you get to submit images. Well, you don't submit them now. Hopefully you've submitted them during the week. So if you haven't done already, please join the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group. And then submit an image for feedback. And what you ideally should do is let me know what kind of feedback you're looking for, because it's not always obvious. Just sticking in a photo and saying, hey, what do you think? Well, there could be a number of things. It's useful for me to know whether you're concerned about, was it the light, was it the composition, were you struggling with particular aspects or camera settings or whatever it happens to be. The whole point of critique is to get feedback so that you can get past your sticking points. We all have them. There's bits we know with the camera, bits we've begun to master with the camera, and bits where we just feel like we've hit a wall, we don't know what's going on, we do something, it doesn't work, we don't know why it doesn't work. And then who do we ask? We stick our photos up on Facebook and all our friends click like or love or hearts or whatever, and they're being lovely, they're telling us our photos are great, but they don't necessarily understand photography and they don't necessarily understand critique, and they don't want to hurt your feelings. Nobody wants to turn around and say, well, actually, you know what, I think that shade of blue just really clashes with what you've done over there. They don't want to hurt your feelings. They don't want to start an argument. So trying to get honest feedback is really difficult. But then there's the other side of it, which is there are plenty of intimidating photographers out there, people you don't really want to ask in case they sneer at you or do you down or make you feel a bit foolish for not knowing. So the whole point of this corner of the internet, this podcast, is to help you get past those sticking points in a safe environment. What I would ask is if you can try and get the photos in by the weekend before the podcast that you want, and certainly not really later than Monday, but if you get to Tuesday, it kind of ends up a bit difficult for me to give proper feedback. Now, I've actually had quite a lot this week. So strangely, last week I only had 2. This week I've got about 9. So some people sent in more than one. So I've had to sort of say, well, okay, I'll cut it down to one. Stacey, I have to say, you really sort of sent yours in at the last minute. I did ask, I wasn't sure whether yours was for critique or whether that was you putting in something for next week's challenge. I left you a comment, but you didn't respond to it. So I've left it out of this one. If you can go back to the comment in the group where you put it and just let me know whether you want me to critique it or whether it's just your entry, that would be great. So we're going to move on to critique. A little reminder, if you find this interesting, if you find it useful, if you would like to support these podcasts, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to do it. Right, okay, so we'll crack on. We've already been about an hour already, so I will try and I might not, well, yeah, we'll just work our way through. Rosie's put in, she's actually already listened to the Voices podcast yesterday. It was brilliant. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Rosie. Thank you. Right, where are we at? So, I'll just click on that and see where we're at. So, if I minimize that, and let's start then. What have we got? So I've done that bit. Let's start with Robert in Texas. So, this was Robert's photo. And Robert says, this is yet another picture of Texas cattle. Thought it was a good pic. I had to remove another cow that was photo bumming the shot. It was recently commended on PhotoCrowd, but has not been doing so well in other contests. I got low, almost to the ground for the angle. I like the composition and texture, however, I would have liked the colour to pop a little bit more. Since this is winter in Texas, things are very brown, much like late summer. Let me know what you think and if there are any ways to improve on the photograph. So this is one of these cases where Robert's created a photo. There's one photo competition online where he's done quite well, but it's also not been really doing quite as well as he expected in other places. So he's looking for a bit of feedback on that. Now, Robert also sent me the original. So actually, if I just click through here. So you can see then that he's done quite a lot of work on this. Now, one of the things I will say, what I like about this, I do like the angle that you've got on this, Robert. I think that being down low to the ground, you're looking up, it gives a sense of the power and the presence of these cows, you know, and their wonderful long horns. You become aware that they are large beasts, that we are but puny humans next to them. I also really like the kind of side backlight or side light, which is kind of just slightly behind them as well. So what it's creating is we've got a nice edge of light running along the back, the legs, catching the ear, the edge of the jaw, the edge of the horns. I think it's a nice, but also what I quite like as well is because the sun is sort of hitting this brown dirt, it's reflecting back up some of this onto the underbelly. So that it's not just, we know it's white, but there's that kind of brown, yellowish brown there, which has come from the sun literally bouncing off the ground back up to light underneath them. So I like the composition. So looking at this, so here we can see the cows that were photo bumming, as you said. And you've obviously gone around and cut them out. What you've also done is you've changed the sky. So you've replaced the sky with a darker blue one, as well as you drawing more detail out of the shadows. Now, what I would say with this is, if we go back to here, one of the things I noticed is that when you've done the sky, I don't know. I'm assuming what you've used some kind of quick program that does it for you. You do a quick lasso and then drop a new sky in. However, it isn't perfect. If we look at the horns here, you can see there's suddenly a blue patch. Similarly, on the back of the cow here. So it hasn't gone right to the edge. It's kind of cut in. It's overlapped in places. There's also bits here where we can see this sort of blue line around the edge. And it is one of the toughest things that you have when you're doing, not noticing it so much of the back, but certainly up here on the shoulder, you're noticing this sort of cutout line here. Notice it particularly up the top, just here as well. And I think, it is one of those problems. Cutting things out is particularly difficult. I'm going to be talking about Rosie's shot in a little while as well, and that, we'll be talking again about it. And it's at the edges where it then becomes noticeable. A quick shot, okay, so if this is sort of being done on if somebody's only looking at it on their phone or Wii tablet and the picture's only this big, you're not going to notice it. But anybody who's sort of looking at this on a larger size is immediately going to start noticing. Another thing I would say is you've got the clouds there, almost like a large hat coming out of, it's sort of nestling in the horns and then kind of coming out behind. Now, I don't know whether you deliberately placed it there or not, but it sort of feels to me a little bit too, it sort of sits too comfortably in the horns and therefore stops looking quite as natural. If those clouds were literally shifted a bit to the right or a bit to the left so that it didn't just sit nestled into the horns, I think that would help a little bit. Otherwise, it's kind of like whether it's a hat or it's a head smoking or a little bit on fire, there's something not quite lining up with the background. So I think these are really part of the other thing. The one other thing that I would say about this is I can't help but feel. So let me just close that. The crop, the ratio, crop ratio, is it? Doesn't fully sit comfortably with me. I think what happens is there are certain ratios which we have become naturally attuned to. So, for example, completely square. We are very used to square photos now. Instagram, a lot of stuff on mobiles, square has become like the default. So we're used to that. We are also used to landscape. We're used to the idea of think TVs, think widescreen TVs, think cinema. We're used to that idea of it being considerably longer than it is higher. And then we're also used to portrait. We're used to the higher than it is wide, either from photos, traditional portraits, sheets of paper, and these days, of course, our phones as well, when we've got them turned up that way. So there are these kind of ratios are the ones that kind of fit most comfortable. Now, the ratio you've got here doesn't quite fit any of them. It's not quite square. It's not quite landscape enough. And I really do feel if you just kind of, let me take this moment and I'll use the content aware fill it won't be perfect, but it will give you an idea. If I stretch that out, but maybe give it a little bit more room at the front, a little bit more at the back, something like that. And hopefully that will fill in. Yeah. See, and immediately I feel like I've got a little bit more room to breathe here. That the cow isn't right up against the edge of got the horn kind of coming right up to the edge. There's not a lot of room here. You want to kind of, because they're facing that way, you want to have them facing into something. So just changing the crop like that, I think, helps the overall composition. But I think if you were to really, you need to kind of go back and take a little bit more care with things where the sky has, that wasn't quite what I meant to do. Yeah, that's where, the sky has turned bits of the back blue or bits of the horns blue as well. So hopefully that gives you some starting points to play around with then, Robert. Right, okay, close that. So what else have we got here? yeah, VG saying the horns tearing the clouds apart. And Stacey loves the cows and your angle in the shot. Robert says, I used Luminar AI, didn't notice the sky coming through. Yeah, it's very easily done. It's it's a bit like, I think sometimes it's a bit like proofreading. Very difficult to do when some people can do it. I'm a terrible proofreader and I think a lot of us are, because we know what it's supposed to say, and so our brain assumes that's what it says, and so we miss the bits where actually it's wrong. Our brain has filled in the gaps. And I think sometimes when we're using these programs where it will replace the sky for you, we're kind of expecting it to do what we're expecting it to do, and so we see it and we don't notice where it hasn't actually lined it up right. So it is one of those things that we just have to be a little bit more careful of. Okay, Lucas is chatting to Robert about using the close gap slider and about the fact that Luminar can do dumb things with sky replacement. Okay, so I've not used Luminar. Lucas has. So Robert, I think actually Lucas looks like the person to chat to about playing around with that particular program. And what else have we got? Robert says start using content aware. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to start getting dragged down a rabbit hole of other people's conversations here. So I can see conversations going on between people in the comments there, which is fine, which is good. I like that actually. I missed a comment here. Michelle also said thank you. I found this really helpful and interesting, but that was about 20 minutes ago. Hopefully you're still around, Michelle. And Nuria she was replying to Stacey about trying charity shops. Right, okay, so that was Robert. So next photo to move on to then. Let's go VG. So VG has been playing around with self-portraiture. She'd like to do more portraiture, but we've got the problem of lockdown, availability of people. But she's also been trying out, we've been chatting a bit, I was going to say offline, it's still online, but it's away from podcasts, exploring ideas. And VG's latest photo, now, she's got a couple of different versions. This was the one she put on Facebook. This is the one she emailed me, which is before it's cropped. And this is the original version. And VG says, self-portrait, interested to hear your feedback with regards to lighting, angle and overall composition. My aim is to bring attention to the face, or the landscape of the face as Kim puts it. Portraits are not my strong area. Comments are welcome. Okay, well, this particular, she sent me 3 different portraits. I didn't have time this evening to go through all of them, so I asked her to pick one, so she chose this one. Interestingly, what I noticed about this one is this one's in reverse. I know VG, she actually has the nose ring on the other side. Self-portraits, we all tend to prefer our self-portraits reversed because we're used to seeing ourselves in the mirror. So when we see ourselves not reflected and turned round, we always think we look a little bit odd. There's a whole long spiel to go along with that, which I've given before and I will give in the future. I'm not going to talk too much about that at the moment. The main thing here for VG is she's wanting to know about lighting and composition. Now, lighting is pretty good. There's a nice sort of, although slight blown high, little kind of bit of glare on the tip of the nose. It's not too bad. Fairly soft lighting. And what I do like is the fact that you've got a backlight here, which is catching the edge of the hair. Now, in your edited version, you've darkened things down a bit here. The background still, which I know is like a sort of sheet of material, I can still see a lot of the creases in it, and that's sort of drawing attention away from you. I think you've overdone, at this point here, you've overdone the dark. We've lost the texture in the hair. And actually, if we go back to the unedited version, I quite like the fact that we've got more texture in the hair. I think the smile is really warm, it's engaging, it's friendly. I think but in terms of space, I would like to feel a little bit more space down to the right and below. And what we're talking about here is to, and I will talk about this again in a couple of pictures time, is the problem of the center of the photo. In compositional terms, the center of the photo is essentially the dead zone. It's the place where it's most balanced, it's most central, and the brain filters it out. If you've heard of things like rule of thirds, if you know about things like diagonals, if you know things sort of dynamic tension, then what you find is off-center tends to grab the attention more than in the center. Not all, there are exceptions to this, but by and large, but certainly with faces. So you want to have that photo, that eye, not necessarily right smack bang in the middle. Now, you did crop in here, and that's better, moves it over to the left a bit, but it's still pretty level in the kind of middle of the photo. So what I really want is more space. I mean, I suppose, again, a bit like, now this won't work very well doing the fill with, because content aware won't know what to do with shoulders and hands and what have you. But just to give you a sense of shape, I think what you really want is a shape a little bit more, if we're going portrait, something like this. You don't necessarily need to have the eyes all the way to the rule of, on that third, but, certainly maybe the brows or something like that. So if we take something like that, now I dread to think what the content aware is going to do with the fill. Yeah, it's not doing nice stuff over here. But if we ignore the fact that it doesn't really know what it's doing, if you take a look at that shape, let's just darken that down with a little bit of but if you're talking about roughly proportions, that gives you a sort of slightly better thing. The other thing is you've got a little bit, but I think sometimes a slight tilt of the head a little bit more as well, again, takes you away from that notion of levels. The minute you start introducing diagonals, do you see that slight more tilt of the head, I think, works better. Because diagonals add more energy, add more life, add more movement into a photo. So I think that tilt, and I think a little bit more space around. So we obviously, this is, you need to pull back and take from further back, and then maybe crop in afterwards. I like the fact that you've got the catch lights in the eye. We've talked about these before. That's these little bits of light catching on the eye. But the other thing is, I notice as I come in closer, is that it's out of focus. It's not really as sharp focus as it should be. And when you're dealing with portraits, especially people, but also with animals, if it's a portrait, then the eyes really need to be in focus. And particularly the eye that is closest to the camera has to be as sharp as you can get it. Now, when I looked at because you sent me the originals in this, when I looked at the settings, you've got an ISO 100, that's great. That gives you, it means there's not a lot of noise creeping into it. You've got F8, which gives you a good depth of fields, so that if you happen to move slightly forward or back between focusing and going click, you're still more likely to be focused. But it's a 1 second exposure. And I understand that's because you're kind of in a dark space, and you really kind of need to get as close to a window as possible, or as bright a light as you can possibly get. And the 1 second is just too long. It's extraordinarily difficult to hold your head absolutely still for a whole second, to the point whereby the camera isn't going to notice it. So really, so for this VG, I mean, that notion of just sort of, you might need to speed up the shutter speed to something like even a 25th of a second or 20th of a second. If you can hold the pose, it would work better. If you can get up to a 50th of a second, it'd be much better. if you're assuming you've got your camera on a tripod. And then maybe an f5.6 to counteract the fact that, you know, you might work, you might need a 6.3, something like that. And then maybe you would have to up your ISO to something like an ISO 400 or even 800. But the problem is once you get to 800, it can kind of get a bit noisy. Those things aside, so it's really about getting your balance for the light. But I think compositionally, I think this idea of have a bit more space down so that you're, you know, when we were in that kind of rule of thirds type thing, your eye is closer to this, you know, an upper corner of the inside square. It doesn't have to be right up there, but just closer. And also that notion of a slight tilt of the head, I think, makes it more interesting, because then you get a little bit more of the diagonal on the eye rather than horizontal. So I hope that helps, VG. And I don't close that. Right. Okay. So where are we? Okay. Sandra says it's a lovely picture, wanting to know how you set things up to take the self-portrait. John agrees that the unedited version has a nicer lighting, because you're editing it, sort of lost the details in the hair. And Sandra's noticing the impact the crop makes, the difference that makes, and VG's also come in to mention what a difference the crop makes. And Maria's making a note of the tilt. And it is one of those things. It's trying to move away from, if you think about almost the antithesis of portrait photography is the passport photo. And the passport photo is dead straight into the lens, shoulders down, everything facing forward, no tilt, no nothing. And that's as an identification photo. But if you want to add something else into it, then you can turn the body. You can tilt the head. You can tilt the head that way. You can lean in. And automatically all these lines start changing. And it becomes a more interesting photo than just straight on, shoulders wide. So all sorts of things we can go into about portraiture there, but another day. Okay, VG saying, am I the only person seeing a blank screen? I hope so. Okay, we should be seeing, I think there's a full screen here. Okay, I'm just going to have to, Stacey's saying passport is horrific, but isn't. Oh no, right, okay, Becca says he froze again, but back out now, so. Right, okay, obviously a tricky one tonight with lots of freezing and pictures not being where they should be. Right, okay, hopefully then we can move on a bit. So next one to talk about is Rosie. Okay, so we're on to another editing one here. So Rosie says, I recently took, okay, we've got, sorry, my screen's fine, oh, you're back. And Rosie says, oh dear, I haven't got a blank screen, although it was freezing earlier. Yeah, so, okay, so there's, and now see fine. So it looks like there's a little bit of come and go as to whether I'm getting through. Some of this we might just have to kind of catch up on YouTube. So Rosie said, I recently took an online fine art editing course. That's her quotes, not me being sarcastic. Run by an equestrian photographer in the UK. I learned about masking, layers, and applied my new skills to this photograph taken a couple of years ago. And so basically what happened was Rosie took this photo and then edited it into this. So she said, I love the position of the horse and rider, but obviously hated the background. I tried a couple of times to do something with the background to tone it down, but was never happy with the results. Using the techniques that she learnt from the equestrian photographer, I replaced the background with a texture, polished the horse, and given her something to ground her. On the whole, I like it, but there is a niggle that the rider still looks a bit cut out. Can you suggest something to make her blend it in a bit more? I'm not sure what I'm doing with overlays and blending modes. I use Photoshop Elements 11 and don't have access to Camera Raw, which was used in the tutorials to help with the blending. P.S. Hannah loves it and wants a print. Oh, that's great that Hannah loves it, so that's good. Okay, so this was your edited version. Now, I'm not going to be able to do a quick cutout. Cutouts take forever, and I'm sure you found that. There are things you can do to try, and where it's at its hardest when you're doing cutouts is when you get into things like tails, wherever there's hair and things like that. But basically, there are two things here that I wanted to say to you about this, Rosie. Why? Now, it does look cut out because it is cut out. That's always going to be a part of it. But there's levels to which it's cut out. And I know what you mean when you feel it just feels like a bit too cut. It doesn't quite have the smoothness that you wanted it to. And the two things I'm going to talk about here, one is essentially color balance and color shift. And because if you look in this here, the natural daylight, it's a dull overcast day, and there's a sort of blue shift in the light. Your natural white balance is sort of tending towards the blues. What you've got here is you've gone for a brown, more yellow shift kind of background. You've brightened up a few things here, which actually you've brought out more of the blues in the hat. And because the highlights on the hat happen to be blue, it's standing out that bit more against the brown. It doesn't really feel like it's blending in to the background. You're very aware of it sitting separate, very separate. So now you can go this two ways. You can either try and sort of colour shift the hat, or and there's even little bits with the legs maybe, but you can try sort of colour shifting essentially just the hat or the hat and rider a little bit, shift it into the yellow a bit. I think you might find that helps. Or you change the background. You could just as easily do a colour shift and change the black background to a blue. That might work as well, although then that, of course, how that sits with the horse is something that you would have to work out. The other thing that I'm going to say as well, I don't really have time to sort of go in. We've still got quite a few to go through, and we're already nearly at 9 o'clock. Because I can't really cut it out and show you convincingly, I will just briefly talk you through. One of the other things that you've got here is you've created a textured background. If I zoom in right here, we can see this texture on the background, which gives it a sort of slightly canvassy feel. And that's fine. That's the texture you chose to go with it. Except for the fact that the rider and horse don't have that same texture. And so instead of this looking like a canvas print, which is what that texture kind of makes it look like, it looks more like a piece of paper cut out and stuck on a canvas. And that's, I think, is the key. That's the key to where it's going. Now, that's not to say that you necessarily have to turn them to exactly the same, have it all the way through. But actually, if you were to overlay the same texture and then mask out them, but softly, stronger in the center, certainly you don't want that texture over her face, but if the texture itself is overlapping at the edges, it's just going to feel like it blends in a little bit more. Always when you're doing cutout, it's the edges which are the killer. They're the bit which make or break when you're replacing something, whether it's the sky that Robert was doing with the cows, or whether it's you adding textures and a different background to this. So a lot of it comes in sometimes just overlapping it by a few pixels or a little bit more. You play with it to see where there'll be a sweet spot somewhere where suddenly you notice it will blend in, but it won't be overpowering. So I hope that makes sense, Rosie. So the two key things I would say is, one is about the colour, because this highlight on her helmet is very blue against that brown background. It just doesn't feel like the background is lit from the same source or lit in the same way that the rider and horse are, and that creates a cutout feel. But the other thing is this texture, because the texture of the horse and rider are not the same as the texture of the background. That also gives it a very cutout feel. So I hope that helps you with that. Right. Okay. Where are we? Right. That was the comments on whether I was freezing or not, and right. Comments going along in back and forth to each other here. VG's replying to John and replying to Marie. Okay, Diana, thanks Kim, feeling inspired to try Still Alive next week. Oh, or this week. Oh, that's good. That's great to know. Okay, Rosie hasn't said anything, so I'm guessing maybe it's frozen too much and she's going to come back a bit later or check out the YouTube video. Will have to say that here in southwest Scotland the weather is a bit grim at the moment. It's been very snow, slush, high winds, so I don't think connections are doing particularly well. And given the fact that this is apparently frozen or even cut out once or twice. Oh no, Rosie is back here. Just the texture came with the course. It also came in teal. I will try and change the colour and see what that looks like. Very helpful comments. Many thanks. Okay, well I'm glad about that. There is also the fact that, like I say, I'm basically about 15 seconds ahead of you. So I make a comment, you've got to go 15 seconds before you hear it, and then if you're typing something in, it could be 30 seconds to a minute before I actually read it. So yeah, it does make the communication slightly halted. It's a little bit worse than that, when you're on a Zoom call with somebody and you start talking over each other because there's that kind of half-second delay. A minute delay makes it a lot worse. So, okay, right. So next then, I'm going to, right, let's move on. Dion. So, let's find Dion's photo. Dion put in a photo of a baby jaguar. And he said, so he was looking for a bit of critique. He had it an f-stop f1.8, so that's a very wide aperture, very shallow depth of field. Exposure time 640th of a second, so that's very fast exposure time, and that's what's managing to catch this growl in mid moment without the mouth being blurred. ISO 500, focal length 50mm. So I'm guessing you probably had your nifty 50 prime lens, is that right? Okay, she was so quick, I had to react quick. Luckily the image was okay. I did a bit black and white conversion in Lightroom and fixed some levels. So I said to Dion, well, if you're happy that the image is okay, what is it you're wanting in terms of critique? And so he came back and said, it's the editing and cropping that is bothering me, especially the dead space above the head. He says, I was also told many years ago focus should be on the eyes. I beg to differ. I will, and then we went off on another conversation with another picture, which I don't have time to go through tonight. Now, basically the point here being that what's in focus here is the mouth. The eyes at the back there are not in focus. Now, everything I just said to VG about the eyes being in focus, I think is absolutely right when it comes to portraits. This, I think, is slightly different because it's not so much a portrait, it's an action shot. And actually having the mouth, the teeth, this part, the front part of the face in focus, I think actually works okay for this. I mean, basically that primal part of puny humans that we are, if we were being attacked by a wild cat, the bit we're going to notice first is not the eyes, but the teeth, the bit that's closest to our face. So in a way, that kind of taps into that slightly more primal human bit, but I think that's because very much this photo, I would say generally yes, go for the eyes first, but that's more if you're trying to get a portrait. This isn't so much a portrait in that sense, this is an action shot. I think if you manage to have it set at f5.6 or whatever, you would have got both, but then you're obviously dealing with a light, and at that point your ISO might have gone too high. So these things are always a compromise. But the other bit there, so I'm not going to argue about you, like I say, with the eye. I think the fact that the teeth are in focus right first is fine for this particular thing. It emphasises that notion that this is a wild cat. This is not your domestic kitty. Now, but the other thing you said is the editing and cropping bother you. And I think actually the crop, there's definitely a thing with the crop. And it's a little bit like with VG. a little bit earlier, and even with Robert. And I think it is. There is a notion here of, I kind of feel like I want to go wider with it almost. So you're right, you don't need as much space at the top here. But you could almost, I think this would work kind of well in more of a landscape format. If you take something like that, so again we've got the eye around in that kind of rule of thirds inside corner of the internal square. Now again, I'll just do the content aware thing here so we can see what it would look like. And here you see this gives it quite a different shape. Obviously this is filling in the back, so it's not perfect, but I think here what happens is, let's just grab that brush a second, I'll turn that to a pencil. We've got quite a nice kind of shape doing that. We've got a nice diagonal with the mouth. Got diagonals coming down here from the jaw up to the corner. I think you get a shape. Now there's a little bit here. I think I don't know whether it's, you know, maybe if this was pulled down a little bit further and we had a little bit of the front legs, but that doesn't really matter. I think the real thing is all about this head. This is the bit that we're interested in with this photo, and I think having a bit of space in front of it allows you to have that feeling. Do you remember, just like the cows with Robert, they're actually having more space in front of the cows allows you to kind of feel like you're moving, there's space for it to move into. You're not right up against the edge, you're not claustrophobic. It's like that notion, if you're ever taking a photo of somebody walking or you're taking a photo of somebody cycling, it generally works much better if you have them cycling into the photo and there's a bigger gap in front of them than there is behind them. Same with a walker, have a bigger gap in front than there is behind. Those cows that are Robert's, bigger gap in front than behind. This bigger gap in the front as well. And I think that kind of thing works a little bit better. Obviously, there's a point whereby you've got a baby jaguar, you're there, anything you can get is good, okay? No, I'm not saying for a moment that I would have had presence of mind to turn my camera the right way if you were just trying to grab a shot where it's just going, all of a sudden. The fact that you've got anything, kudos to you, good stuff, Dion. If you're in a point though where you think, okay, maybe I do have time to, you know, to do this a couple more times, I've got time to set it up a little bit, then I would say you maybe consider the idea of doing landscape. Allow a bit more space around it, even stand back a little bit and allow. I often say that when you're taking photos, take more than you need. If you're at all uncertain, if you've got time, fine, compose it perfectly in camera. But if you're at all uncertain, and if you're taking photos of things that are moving, step back a bit, take more than you need so that you've got space to crop in and get the balance that you actually want that way. So hopefully, Dion, that helps a bit. Right, okay, where are we at? Let's close that. Okay, next photo then, we're going to move on to Becca. Now, Becca sent me 3 different photos. I did say there was a lot happening tonight, so I wasn't really going to talk about all 3 of them. But there is something about all 3 of them that I find kind of interesting. I'll just concentrate on the one that she asked about particularly, but I do just want to show you all 3. So Becca sent this photo, this one, and this one. Her comments were, I've submitted a few here as I've been working on framing. Some light retouching in Lightroom. I feel like I've concentrated too much on capturing the personality and characteristics. I hope I haven't sacrificed the technicalities, composition, etc. Taken 3 different days, all natural light, slightly different conditions, frost, snow and rain. Thanks for your time. So what Becca's doing here is essentially a frame within a frame, and it's a fun concept. So that's why I kind of wanted to show you all three here. So here's Becca's daughter. You can see her eyes are within the shape of this. In this one, she's framed daughter and friend, dad, inside sorry, I'll flip over. I wasn't. I've lost count the number of times I've done this. Right. Okay, to go back in here, this is the one where she's got her daughter's eyes showing through. Here we've got looking between the tree trunk, and here we've got the horse framed by the trees. And it's a great idea. That idea of the frame within a frame is a kind of fun one to play with. You know, it's like you can do a view out of the window, but if you include the window as well with a little bit of wall or curtains, then that changes the mood and the feel of it. Looking through a gap where you're not just seeing beyond it, but you're actually seeing the structure of the gap, kind of creates something interesting. So I think it's an interesting exercise, and it's one of these worth going and playing around with. Now, what Becca did say is she fears that she might have sacrificed on the technicals, and actually on a couple of these she has. So, you know, particularly noticeable on this one, what's happened is this little droplet running down this front here is nice and sharp. The eyes are not so sharp. So the camera's focused just in front of your daughter's eyes. And to go back to what we've been talking about, the eyes do need to be in focus. And then if we flip back to here with the horse, I think you've got the same problem. Same problem in the fact that the eyes are slightly out of focus, the nose is in focus. And unlike Dion's picture of the baby jaguar, this photo isn't about the nose and the mouth. This isn't about, you know, it's part of the horse, but this is more of a kind of horse portrait. So we do actually want to have the eyes in focus. The other thing I would say is there's a slight oddness about the crop with this, which again, echoing back to what we were talking about with Robert earlier, is it's not quite square, but it's not quite portrait either. So I kind of want to sort of shape it a bit more, either to make it landscape, either a bit more landscape, a bit more portrait, or square. But the other thing is that, to go back to the picture we talked about with VG, is these eyes are kicking about pretty much on the middle level. And I think you want to have them higher up in the picture. And again, more space to breathe below the mouth. So on something like this, if you were doing it square, you would really want to have, where are we? It'd be something like that's 4,900. Yeah, so that's actually a square crop. Let's just do a quick content aware to show you how that works. That obviously is not ignore these bits of mouth coming in here, but in terms of overall shape, I think that works a bit better. I'd also be you could lower that a bit. Again, take this, pull it out off to the right a little bit, maybe a little bit to the left, creating more of a, now if you've got this kind of thing, I think again, this isn't going to fill in exactly, but it gives you a sense of the shape of what's going on, Becca. That's got bits of horse face all over the place. Okay, just imagine that's foliage, or just imagine that's trees and barbed wire. But you can see in terms of shape, I think that's the key thing with this, is that you have more shape within it. And I think that looks a little bit more interesting. Alternatively, again, we go portrait, and you're kind of coming down something like that. Although I understand at this point, we would end up missing some of the framing that you were doing over on the right. And also at that point, the barbed wire fence seems to really cut through a bit too strongly. So the thing is with this, Becca, is that there were a number of different crops you could do with this. I think that not quite square, not quite portrait, not quite landscape just isn't it's sort of, it's back to that thing. I think we are used to, we're more comfortable with that idea of either something which would look good on a kind of TV screen or computer screen or a phone or Instagram. You know, those are kind of the crops where I think you tend to, when they're not cropped like that, it just sort of doesn't quite feel. But I also think the big thing here really is that you need to leave space underneath the mouth so that there's a little bit more, because otherwise it kind of feels like it's pushing right to the edge of the picture. And then, yes, get the eyes in focus. Always the most important part. If you're doing children, if you're doing animals, you're doing people, eyes in focus, and with the exception of Dion's one, where if it's about the mouth, then fine, it's about the mouth. But in this case, it isn't about the mouth, it is about the eyes. We're wanting to make eye contact with the horse. So, hope that helps. Right, okay, let's close that. Okay, what else have we got here? Oh, Rosie liked the cat and the landscape crop. Okay, yes, a couple of people saying, show the photograph. Yes, that's me forgetting to do the thing. Good ideas for different photos. Rosie says, Bonnie Pony Becca. And Becca says, yeah, cropped in too much, should have sent you the original. VG likes the landscape crop. Okay, cool. So we're getting a sense then of, I think cropping is a definite theme that's been going on so far here. Right, okay. A couple more now for Still Life Challenge. Not Still Life Challenge, sorry, the Still Life, for the critique. For the critique now we have 3 more pictures to go, and then I'll talk about the Still Life Challenge. Now, the next 3 pictures that I'm going to be showing you are all still life. So time is running on. We're already at 15:15. I don't want to sort of drag too much past 2 hours, and it's kind of going that way. So these will probably be slightly briefer. But Sandra's picture, excuse me, let's flip this into Photoshop and just drag this one straight in. And Sandra says, here is Christmas still life I did with some crackers and chocolates. Oh no, that was, sorry, she sent in 2 pictures. That was a different picture. Here's a so she says, most of the time I struggle with composition and interest, like the second photo which I've included, which is this one. Feedback welcome. So in essence, what's happened here is, so Sandra's got these 5 chocolates sitting in the middle of the picture and not a lot happening, and feeling a bit kind of, well, I photographed chocolates, nothing's really happening with them. Why, who, where, how, what do I do? And I think basically the part of the first problem here, you remember what I was saying about VG with the front eye, is that the center of the photo is kind of a dead zone. There's that notion of the off center, you know, just like we've been doing now, cropping the cat and cropping the cows and the horse and what have you. Same thing applies to objects. If it's too central, it's too balanced, we kind of lose interest. So even something like this, even if we sort of crop in slightly to one side, it immediately starts to create slightly more interest. Now, I'm not saying that solved the problem, but you can see that even that has a slight advantage over that. I think the main problem with this, though, is we're not really sure what it's about. And I think there's a level here, and especially with still life, which is story. What's the purpose of the photo? What do you want to do with the photo? What's the purpose of these ones? If it's to show off how yummy and scrumptious they are, then you need to give us a hint of that. You know, maybe one of them is broken open. Do you remember were you around for the mince pie shoot I did before Christmas, where you have, like, you know, there's an open mince pie, so you can see the texture of the mixed fruit on the inside. Do these have any interesting inside? Could you open them? Put teeth marks in them. Could they be sitting with something else? So I think there's a whole bunch of things really going on here where it feels like you've put stuff on a plate and taken a photo, but you haven't really thought of the why, the purpose. What story do you want to tell? Why do you want to take these You know, what do you want to do with these? What story do you want the viewer to take away with them when they look at them? And if you ask that question, I think that's the key question. If you ask that question, then that makes all the difference as to what you do next. Because you could light them differently, you could put other things with them. You know, are you trying to make them look tasty, or is it the colour that you find most interesting, or is it the shapes that you find interesting? What are the bits that make you go, ooh, why is it you wanted to photograph these in the first place? And if you can somehow really narrow down that, Sandra, I think you'll suddenly find that it will work. You'll start getting better ideas of what to do next. There's so many different ways you can go with something like this, that you've got to start narrowing down what it is you want to do before you can start heading in the direction. So I know it doesn't really solve the problem with this photo, but hopefully if you're asking the right questions, it kind of helps you move forward a bit. Right. Okay, so what I'm going to move on now is Marie. Marie says, this is my first attempt at a still life challenge, also my first post. Yeah, so this is Marie's joined us from South Africa, so I'm very glad you could make it along. And all right, sorry, VG's just seeing one up from VG saying it's 10 to 3 in the morning in India. I say good night to everyone and catch up with the recording tomorrow. Looking forward to next week's challenge. Yeah, I'm always amazed you stay up this late, VG. Go and get some sleep. Right. Okay. So, Marie. Yes. So Marie's photo was this one. So starting an attempt at a still life, looking for some feedback on it. Now, some nice textures, interesting colours, very dark background, very dark background. Now, what I thought this was a completely black background, but actually when I opened it in Photoshop, I noticed that it is in fact slightly lighter. Now, you're not quite seeing it on the screen there. If I just going to take the curves for a moment and drag that up, and you can actually then see that there is in fact a bit of background, and you can see like there's where the line runs here. Now obviously everything's become too bright, but actually there's something I quite like about a little bit of texture in the background, and maybe the whole thing doesn't have to be completely black. The other thing we notice when we bring up that is that there's actually a bit of reflection down here of the bulb of the plant, which isn't there when we're just at the normal levels that you've got. So I think there's potential here for you don't actually necessarily have to darken down everything else so much. There's you can kind of add to it with a little bit of background texture with the reflection perhaps. The other thing that strikes me about this is a very tall, thin plant. And there's a lot going on in it, but again, it sort of feels to me like it's just everything is up the way. And I can't help but feel I would like to sort of have something else in it. And I suppose it goes back to you said, can a still life be one thing? Yes, it can. Something like this is, you know, I suppose classic still life. It is one thing, but although it's made up of 3 parts, you've got the bulb, you've got the stem, and you've got the flower. But I just want to show you something for a moment here, which is if we again maybe pull this out a bit, crop this something like that. I'll just do the actually let's go back here a moment. Do the content aware because I do want to get that little bit of texture background. If we were to do something like this, so it's off to one side, and just to take the curves, sort of show that texture background in the back there. Now obviously it's blown everything else out, so that's not quite right. Now what you've got is you've got this to one side, but you don't have anything over here. But if you had another object here, it would offer, you know, something that offset against the tallness of this. So something fairly short down into kind of diagonally bottom from it. And to show you what I mean here is if I just copy that layer, and then what I'm going to do is just shrink that down. So we've got just a smaller version of this. And then I'm going to flip it horizontal. Because this large one leans over to the right a bit, I'm going to have this one leaning into the left a bit. And then if I sort of just drag this in, something like that, I'll just mask out some of that. Wrong one. Do the mask. That's what I wanted. It's just so that that's not getting in the way so much. So I don't know how well you can see that now, but I think having that extra piece in it that's smaller, it's kind of diagonally down from it. Now it doesn't have to be another plant. I'm just using that because that's what happens to be here. It's kind of up to you as to what else you will put there. But I think something else into the picture really adds and lifts and emphasizes what you've got over here. Something shorter over here makes more sense of the length of this without it just feeling like it's sitting on its own one long tall thing. And if we're talking still life, I think, to go back to what we said right at the very beginning, it's still life if there's just one object in it. It's more like product photography in a way. I think still life really is about an arrangement, and I think you can have that with two things. Two things create an arrangement. How you then place them in relation to each other then changes everything. So that was really what I wanted to say to you about that, Marie. Hopefully that's just kind of trigger some ideas for you. So thanks for sending that in. Okay. So, okay, Sandra says, thanks for giving me some ideas. I'll have another go at photographing some more chocolates. Yep, there's the trickiness with photographing chocolates is just not eating them. Okay, so now Lucas. I want to talk about Lucas because Lucas, on the face of it, has has also gone for another picture, a sort of tall plant, a bit like Marie's. So if I just drag this one over and then show you, so this is Lucas's picture. And Lucas says, one of my first attempts to our still life challenge. I have problems with the composition here. Something is not right, but I don't know what. And oh yeah. We all have that, don't we? You know, we've taken a photo, we think something's working here and something isn't, and we're not totally sure what isn't working. Okay, brief moment, hive mind. What do you think? Anybody else looking in here? What's your first thought when you look at that? What might not be working? Have you typed anything? Okay, I'm going to start saying now. And of course, you will type things after I've started talking. Or at least I won't see them until after I've started talking. So basically, the main thing here, I think, well, there's two things. One is the angle of it. I think it sort of goes up and it comes over. It's, again, not quite straight, not quite diagonal. And I think there's again, if you're going to go diagonal, you want to have more diagonal. If you're going to go straight, you maybe want to have that a little bit straighter. It looks like it's kind of falling over in the pot rather than it's naturally leaning over in the pot. If you can see, there's a stick that it's tied to, and the stick has just sort of tilted over a bit. And you kind of want to have that straight. Maybe. So that's one of the, or you have it bent and it's curved over and it's very deliberately diagonal. I think if you're going for, deliberate curves, deliberate diagonals, that's fine, that works. But the bit where it's a bit like, you know, when player sometimes have talked about when people sending something and the horizon isn't quite straight. You can do quite interesting photos with a very bold diagonal horizon. But if you're not deliberately going for a diagonal horizon, you have to make sure that that horizon is absolutely horizontal. Because if it's just slightly off, it just kind of looks wrong. And I think there's a similar thing here. It's not quite right. It's not quite, you either have it straight or you make a point of it not being straight. But that's compositionally. I think the big thing is the whacking great bright patch on the table in the front. In front of this bowl, you know, the light is also catching this this pot. So this blue part here is very bright, but it's not really what the picture is about. Likewise, this part of the table is really bright, but there's nothing on it. So the brightness is grabbing all our attention, but without delivering anything. So to use a trick I've used before now, I don't know whether you've seen this one, Lucas, or it might be a couple of months since I last used it. But one of the things you can do, I'll just create a copy there, and then I'm going to go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to really kind of, not just a little blur, but quite a big blur, like that, to the point whereby you can no longer see what exactly it is. And then I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees. So that in essence, what we're doing here is we don't know what it is. I mean, you know what it is because you've just seen it. But essentially, if you look away and you look back, you're now just seeing light. And what happens is the eyes get drawn to the place of biggest contrast. And we've got two areas. We've got this bit down here, which we know happens to be the flower head. And we've got this bit up here, which is your table. And then there's a little colour blue, which is also grabbing our attention a bit. And that's the flower pot that it's sitting in, or the pot that it's sitting in. But neither the pot nor that large white patch are really what the photo's about. The photo is about the flowers. If it was about, you know, like Marie's picture, if you had something else sitting on the table, then what you're talking about is the relationship between what's on the table and the flowers. But here, you're not getting that relationship. What's happening is it's competing with the flowers. And really, with something like this, to get the crop, I mean, you're almost better off just kind of taking the flowers off onto their own. Now, because they lean off to the left, I would sort of do something like that. But so, you know, something like that, I think, starts to become, you know, and then maybe you get in closer and you start playing around, particularly with the texture. I mean, that's quite nice, actually. I quite like that as a crop as well. Let's just do something like that and come out so you can see it on its own. And you know, because that's really where the story is. That's really what's happening. We've got a nice diagonal running through it. There's an energy here. You see, because we're not so worried about the stick, whether it's straight or not, the diagonal of those flowers there and the curve of the stick around the top really now give it a dynamic energy to it, and it becomes interesting. And there's places here where you might go in and you might tone down some of the highlights, bring out a little bit in the shadows, really play with the texture of those leaves. I think because there's something quite beautiful about them. It's a different kind of photo though. And basically what I'm doing here, I suppose, is I'm rescuing, or I'm trying a different attempt of what you can do with the same plant. Because if you come back to here, what's happening is this bit of table is just competing too hard with the flowers. It's about the flowers, but we're getting drawn down to that table. And when we've got a photo where we've got two competing things going in it, it never feels like it works so well. So I hope that helps there, Lucas. I hope that gives you the information you need to mess around and play with that. So, thank you very much. So, what have we got? A couple of little comments here, I think, before I started talking. Okay, so Sandra said, you're right about not eating the chocolates in one of my photos. In one of the ones in my photo have all been eaten. And then Rosie saying, be strong, Sandra. Okay, the quick response is Sandra said the clear pot is distracting. Robert says negative space. Marie says, thank you, I even like the background you pulled up. We'll do a proper still life for next week. That's great. I'll look forward to seeing what you do with that. Becca says the pot is too small for the clear pot. So the plastic pot that's sitting inside is kind of sitting a bit too high. Samantha says, lose the stem. Or I lose then stem. I think there's something wrong with the auto text there, but I'd probably lose the stem. But or I love the stem. No, I'm not sure quite what you said there, Samantha. Your auto thing obviously overrode something. Stacey said background. Lucas said position of the table maybe. Marie looking the wrong way into the past. Ooh, now there's a thought. That's about whether things are looking to the left or looking to the right. And that shows your bias as the fact that you read from left to right rather than some of the texts like Hebrew or Arabic, which read from right to left. Would that change the way that you perceive the photo? Just the thought. So Rosie then says perhaps a larger pot for the orchid would balance it out. And so those were all a few minutes ago. And then Lucas is saying that's helpful. He'll try again. Darker tablecloth, another option. So, okay, where are we? All right, and Samantha's come back in main. She meant lose the stem. Yeah, so that's more about kind of the zooming in, I think. Cool. So we're now coming basically pretty much at the end of the program, but I want to talk a little bit about the Still Life Challenge for next week. For those of you who can hold on a couple more minutes. In essence, what I want you to remember then is the point of the still life is it's an arrangement of inanimate objects. Those inanimate objects can be anything. Can be flowers, they can be fruit, they can be coffee pots, they can be chocolates, they can be kitchen implements, they can be knitting needles, they can be pegs, they can be toys. Anything you've got around the house can be used in a still life setup. But what you really want to be thinking about is meaning. What's the purpose, or what do you want to convey from it? What kind of mood do you want to capture? Are you wanting to make us chuckle? Are you wanting us to kind of feel slightly melancholic? Are you wanting us to feel excited or anticipating or anxious or disturbed or warm, friendly, envious? If you start thinking about what mood do you want the viewer to have, or what meaning do you want to get across? And I think if you start understanding that there's you taking the photo and then there's somebody going to be looking at that photo, if somebody else is going to be looking at it, what impression do you want them to take away with them? And if you can answer that question or even get close to thinking about that question, it immediately starts to inform what you're going to do next, how you're going to light it, how you're going to arrange it, what things you're going to include. But importantly, what's the relationship between each thing that you include? You know, you can take a photo of one thing, you add another, and there's immediately a relationship between them. How do you exploit that? And if you've got other aspects in them, are they enhancing the story or are they detracting from the story that you're trying to tell? Each aspect in that photo, each aspect in that arrangement is enhancing or detracting from what you're trying to get across. You can copy something, you can copy something almost literally. So you've seen an idea, have a go at doing it. Deconstruct it. How was it lit? How was it set up? What was used? Do your own version of it. The fact you're doing your own version of it, you will learn by doing it. We all learn our drawing at school through copying, and then we take it to our own level. Or maybe you want to do something which is like something like the photo that I did right back at the beginning of this podcast all those weeks ago. I was trying to be using the inspiration of Dutch old masters from the 17th century, looking at the relationship between food objects on the table, and light. So you can create your own version. And then within the composition itself, the main things you need to think about are how these things sit. Are you doing rule of thirds? Are you playing around with symmetry or asymmetry? You know, things not looking like they're nearly balanced, but not quite, and quite deliberately not quite balanced. Think about the light, the shadow, the reflections, the surfaces, the materials you're using, how the light is falling on them, and how it's falling on them in relation to how it's falling onto the other objects in the shot. Think about things like the leading lines. If there's something pointing out of it, whether it's a knitting needle or the stem of a pear or a hand on a Lego figure, where's it pointing? And is it drawing your eye back into the photo, or is it taking your eye out of the photo? So think about your leading lines. How can you create the relationship between the things? Maybe there's an overhanging leaf which is pointing to a small dish holding a candle. You know, whatever it is, you're looking for ways of creating lines. And then colour. You can do these in black and white, but if you're going to use colour, think about the relationships of colours as well. So you don't have to do all these things in the one image, but pick something. Think about your light, or think about your leading lines, or think about your kind of composition, rule of thirds or symmetry. Think about colour. Think about reflections. Think about relationships. And if you can get 1 or 2 or 3 of these things into the same photo, then you're really cooking on, you're onto something here. And this is the real thing. And I think if you really have a go at this, and of course you're going to get frustrated, of course you're going to try things and it's not going to work, but if you keep coming back to it and eventually you will get something, I think you will learn loads in the process. Stick your photos in, try and get them to me by the weekend. Okay, so that will be by Sunday the 7th. If you can stick them in earlier, that will be better. But I can probably take things on Monday, maybe. But if you leave things till Tuesday the 9th, then there's quite a possibility I might not be able to put them into the thing. So sooner the better you can. But you've got a few days to sit and play around, or to go and raid your archives and see if you can find pictures which already kind of do what you want, but now you can edit them in a slightly different way. How you're going to crop them, how you're maybe going to darken or lighten particular aspects of them. So that's the challenge, your still life challenge for next week. Do give it a go. Put something in. We can then go through the photos next week and see what other people have done and be inspired. So I want you to see if you can inspire somebody else or be inspired. Or alternatively, if you try something, you've got so close and something's not right, let me know when you put it in and I'll see if I can correct it in a bit like the critique. It's not going to be a predominantly critique one, but I will help if you need it. That's it. If you found this useful, you would like to support these podcasts, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Or quick comment there from looking for the glasses on the top. I've taken them off my head. Marie says, can we post more than one? You can. I will just say a lot depends on how many people post images. If I get beyond 20 images, it's going to take all night. So I will start limiting down. If only 4 of you bother putting things in, you can stick in 4 each and that's fine. But yeah, put in a primary one, the one that you're most keen on. Have a secondary one if you want, just in case that not so many people take part. Okay, so Nuria says, thank you much, learnt a lot, see what you can do with a pocket-sized camera. Okay, and now everybody's saying good evening, thanks for the feedback, and good night. So, much appreciated. Thank you for sticking around in what I think is probably the longest one we've done yet at 2¼ hours. Apologies for everybody who's got a sore butt for sitting so long. See you next Tuesday. You take care. Bye-bye.